Every revolution has its hero. Every empire has its nightmare. For France, that nightmare was Jean-Jacques Dessalines, born enslaved, forged into a general, the man who beat Napoleon's armies. He created the first nation in history to outlaw slavery forever. Today, historian Julia Gaffield takes us inside her new book, I Have Avenged America, to uncover the real Dessalines, the visionary who demanded liberty and equality at any cost. This is Too Complicated for History.
Welcome to Too Complicated for History. I am Isaac S. Loftus, joined as always by my co-host, Dr. Lynn Robbins.
Hey, everyone.
And we come to you twice a month to bring you the history that has fallen through the cracks of your curriculum. And we have an awesome guest with us today.
Yes, we are very excited today to welcome Dr. Julia Gaffield, Associate Professor of History at William & Mary, to talk about her new fantastic book, I Have Avenged America, Jean-Jacques Dessalines and Haiti's Fight for Freedom. Thanks so much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I absolutely love your book. I was very thankful to get to read it before we did this interview. And so my first question for you is, how did this become your topic? And if you could just give us a brief overview of who Jean-Jacques Dessalines is before we sort of get into the weeds of the book.
Sure. So thank you very much for having me and for reading the book in advance. Dessalines was a leader of the Haitian Revolution. He was the man who declared Haitian independence, and he was Haiti's first head of state. And I really started kind of studying Dessalines when I was in undergrad. This was like the first time I learned about the Haitian Revolution. I hadn't learned about it in high school, and I took a kind of general history of the Caribbean class at the University of Toronto with Melanie Newton. And basically I was like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. I want to learn more. But I was always like really interested in learning more about what happened after the revolution. I had kind of noticed that in a lot of the narratives, it was like, and then they declared independence and they won, the end. And I was like, well, what happens next, you know? And so Dessalines is a key part of that story. So the first book I wrote, Haitian Connections in the Atlantic World, focused on Dessalines and other leaders, their kind of diplomatic negotiations and their efforts to maintain independence and their kind of fight against diplomatic non-recognition. So I've been studying Dessalines for a while. I was struck by like how many people wanted to write biographies of Toussaint Louverture, which is great. There should be so many biographies of Toussaint Louverture. But like nobody wanted to write a biography of Dessalines. And I thought that there was a real need for a biography of Dessalines for a variety of reasons. And so it was kind of, I saw, this nice meeting of like, I think there's a need for this, but also this has been my interest for a fairly long time.
Do you have any ideas to why people weren't, focused on him before?
Yeah.
I have many thoughts about this.
Any
theories about this. Like I can't get into everybody's brains and be like, well, why didn't you?
Sure.
But I think it has to do with that he was kind of a very radical revolutionary. He was the one who declared independence. But then there's this 200 plus year tradition of really criticizing him. And it started during his life. And it was a way for people to kind of criticize and undermine Haiti as a country. And so his identity and character became tied up with those portrayals. Right. And so, depicting Dessalines as violent and as like a, savage, and barbaric person was a way to undermine Haiti as a country. And so he's got this really negative image that starts during his life, but then gets repeated up until very recently. And so I think he's just kind of been made out to be like this, much more controversial figure, much more radical than Toussaint Louverture, which it was like, the contrast between the two, I don't think is as great as people make it out to be. But there's a way that I think scholars have, made Louverture into like much more of like a French revolutionary than a Haitian
Right.
revolutionary.
Gotcha. This is an
Right.
inaccurate comparison, but it reminds me a little bit of like the dynamic between like MLK and Malcolm X,
I
where
think it is
you have like someone that's
That's
slightly
a
more radical
yep.
that
yeah,
gets vilified, and the other one that sort of gets
right.
the opposite stuff happens to them.
It is a
When
fair analogy.
okay,
And what I love so much about your book is you're able to talk about his childhood. And I know that that's just tough in general with a lot of people from 18th century earlier, but you make him appear more human, perhaps, than most people have thought about him as a person versus a revolutionary. So he was born into slavery, and he was born on Saint-Domingue, which was the name of the part of the island prior to the creation of Haiti. So, can you talk a little bit about his experiences as an enslaved person? And I kind of enjoyed some of your stories about him. So,
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to learn a whole lot about his early life because his early life was very poorly documented.
mhm,
But he was born probably in the year 1758 in the northern region of Saint-Domingue in a parish called Grande Rivière du Nord. And he was enslaved on probably two different coffee plantations in the mountains. And so Saint Domingue is very well known as a colony that produced a whole lot of sugar, or exported whole lot of sugar, and that sugar was produced by enslaved people. But he lived on coffee plantations in a slightly different region. The first person who enslaved him was a man named Duclos, who was a poor white person, and was kind of said to be like a very cruel person. But then he was at some point sold to a free black man named Philippe Jasmin, who sometimes went by the last name Désir. And then over the course of the next decades, he was likely enslaved by two other people, a woman named Marie Marthe, who was the wife of Philippe Jasmin, and then a man named Jean-Jacques Dessalines, whose last name he ended up keeping for the rest of his life. On these coffee plantations, he was enslaved with extended family members, kind of different in different ways on each of the plantations. Um, but he also kind of developed a community within the region of like friends and kind of people who later became like more colleagues or other officers in his unit. And so I see this as a time where he like kind of developed really long-standing relationships that he would carry with him the rest of his life. But it was also a place where I think you see the like beginning of his fight against slavery. And I have a chapter called Un mauvais esclave, and this was how it means a bad slave. And this was how he was described kind of after the fact by this
mhm,
French consul, that he was like known to be a bad slave, somebody who kind of resisted being told what to do and didn't take orders under slavery. And so I kind of sense the beginning of this like fight against slavery, but in that capacity, it was more, against his own enslavement.
mhm.
I think our listeners are relatively familiar with North American slave societies
Mhm.
at some level. Are there any significant differences between like what we would be familiar with, in the United States as far as that history versus what like a French colony would have been at the time?
Yeah.
The institution of slavery in Saint Domingue kind of shaped like every aspect of life. Even those who were not enslaved or enslavers were their entire lives were still kind of fundamentally shaped by the institution. That was in a way like the whole point of the colony
Mhm.
was for export crops, and those export crops were produced by enslaved laborers. So there's a institutional centrality, but then there's also this like demographic difference. And the vast majority of people in the colony were enslaved. And I think it's the statistics right about right before the Haitian Revolution. I think it's almost 500,000 people were enslaved, and about 40,000 were free, and the free population was composed of both white people and free people of color. So it's a drastically different kind of demographic situation in Saint-Domingue than in many of the colonies in North America.
Oh wow, I didn't realize it was that
Yeah.
lopsided.
Yeah.
That's pretty incredible.
Right.
And
But I mean, that shapes like, and because of that demographic difference, right, it means that slavery, slavery is violent everywhere,
Mhm.
but, you know, that institution is upheld in this specific context through the use of extreme violence, the threat of violence, and actual violence.
So for our listeners who don't really know this area very well, it's in the Caribbean, and of course it's currently Haiti, but it's also part of it's Santo Domingo, and then the part that the French are on is called Saint-Domingue. So can you give us just a quick history of how that happened?
Right. So the island as a whole is referred to as Hispaniola, and it was identified as such, by Christopher Columbus. But its name before the arrival of Columbus was Haiti, which obviously you can see the connection with later. The As a colony, it was called Santo Domingo, and both the colony and the kind of primary city on the eastern side of the island. But beginning in the late 17th century, the French colonized the western side of the island, and eventually gain kind of full control over it, although the Spanish don't concede that till much later, but that's another story. And so the colony of Saint-Domingue comprises kind of the western third or so of the island. But the border between the two colonies on the island is kind of very porous, poorly defined. And there's some kind of cool maps from the 18th century that are like, well, and this is kind of the border, but this is like the proposed new border. But it's important for Dessalines' life because the region where he lived, Contreville du Nord, was in this kind of mountainous region that was just north of the border between, or the fake border, whatever, imagined border between the two colonies. And this becomes very important in the early revolution as there's fighting between the two sides. But it's an island that is colonized by both the Spanish and the French, and this kind of really shapes a lot of the revolution, but also shapes Dessalines' life.
Right. And you do mention that Dessalines is a Creole, and that seems very important to the story. Can you explain what that means?
A Creole is somebody born in the colony,
Okay.
both enslaved people, but also colonizers. It's significant to kind of discuss his place of birth, even though we don't have a whole lot of information about it. But, this was one of the things that during his life, he was like, accused of being an African, as a way to like undermine his leadership, and these very like racist descriptions that are like, oh well, he's a barbarous African. And sometimes the people writing this would specify that they meant, yes, he was born in Africa, but other times it's unclear, and maybe they just meant like, oh, he had, he acted like an African, whatever that means. And so the kind of enslaved population on the island was divided between people born in the colony and people who were born in Africa and who had suffered the transatlantic slave trade, who were referred to as Bosal. And these kind of two different social groups within the enslaved community had kind of different like politics, different ideas about what freedom meant, and there's conflict between these groups before the revolution, but throughout the revolution and after.
Interesting. That's imagining all the different mixes of things is something that we don't often.
Yeah.
It's one of those things that it's really difficult to get into in a nuanced way.
I think, like, if you think about, okay, if you want to do like a brief overview of the Haitian Revolution,
Mhm.
there was like so many different groups and people involved that it's really difficult to do a simplistic, like, okay, and here are the players, and here's what they're fighting for, and who they're fighting against. So it is like very complicated, and there's overlap between the groups. There's alliances and changing alliances. So it is like a very complicated, lay of the land in terms of the population.
Sure. So in this Dessalines growing up in this environment, and he was born into enslavement. Was he enslaved all the way up until the point of the revolution?
Yes. He was enslaved for just over 3 decades. It was around 33 when the revolution started, and he secured his freedom while fighting for the Spanish in the first couple years of the revolution, right? So they revolutionaries kind of secure their own freedom in a sense of abandoning the plantations, becoming fugitives, but he has his freedom kind of legally recognized by a colonial power while fighting for the Spanish under the Black auxiliaries of King Carlos IV.
So I think because the revolution is so complicated, which I was realizing while reading your book, you had mentioned the what we call the French and Indian War, but worldwide is known as the 7 Years' War. And this was a major turning point in race and slavery on the island. And so, can you talk about that? Because it seemed like that was also a really important moment in the coming of this revolution that creates Haiti.
It is, if you think about the kind of the long term, right? The 7 Years' War is important everywhere,
Yep.
but in Saint-Domingue, it's this moment where France tries to kind of regain tighter control over the colony to make more money. And one of the ways that they do this is, with racism, that they're trying to create an alliance among white people, bringing the white colonists into a kind of tighter alliance with the metropole, less colonial independence. And so they initiate a bunch of policies that restrict the rights and kind of social freedoms of free people of color. And the free people of color composed about half of the free population, which is significant, right? And so this is a kind of a very stratified group, right? There's poor free people of color, there are wealthy free people of color, there are plantation owners and enslavers within this population as well. But they have their rights and freedoms restricted by a lot of these new laws. And so there's a kind of, you see like a bigger divide. And it's not to say that racism didn't exist before these policies, but they're much more kind of stringent and enforced after the 7 Years' War. And so this starts to divide the free population.
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing for racism to be sort of a cultural norm, and another thing for it to be codified.
Well, but then even further, it's like even if it is codified, then having those laws enforced,
right? Yeah, codified and enforced.
Right.
Like those are three different things, really.
Right.
But yeah, that's horrific but fascinating.
Yes.
And I guess that makes sense in that the French didn't import white colonists the same way that England did, right? Like there were even in the way that the middle of the North American continent, Lynn, you can correct me if I'm wrong. Like the French controlled the Louisiana territory, but there weren't a lot of people there. They didn't have a lot of French Europeans sort of on the continent.
And I think it's just a different sense of like what the colony was for.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Interesting.
And I imagine that would be quite offensive to, for example, the free people of color who are wealthy, because they're really being, kicked in the teeth because they're of the elite classes, and now all of a sudden their rights are being taken away because of the idea of race, and economics no longer matter.
I mean, which is, again, it's not hard and fast, right? And many of them have family members. But there are restrictions, and they're constantly identified in documents in the second half of the 18th century as being people of color, which they they take offense to. They're limited in terms of what kind of jobs they can hold, particularly in the colonial militias, right? This is like the kind of local military that keeps the order of the plantations, and they are certainly enlisted to serve in the militias, but they can't be officers, and so they're constantly having their kind of rights limited, but then also being insulted.
Sure.
Right.
And given the population numbers that you had stated, There was no one in court that was like, hey, maybe this isn't a good idea. Like, we're trying to, like, build a coalition over here, but we may be alienating a good portion of the folks over there. They didn't see it coming at all.
I mean, like, maybe there were a few people, but
Sure.
they were not, particularly vocal about it. But it's also like I think there's, when you see this at the start of the revolution, that there's like an inability to take responsibility for what's happening. Right. And there's a whole lot of finger pointing of like, why did this revolution start? It couldn't be us. It was definitely everybody else's fault. And they blame free people of color for agitating for equal rights, rather than kind of seeing their own role in taking away rights and, enslaving people, for example.
Right. Yeah.
One of those true and tested stories that continue throughout history to today. Yes.
So what sets off this whole, the actual revolution itself? Like, obviously the tensions built, and obviously people are animosity is growing towards the colonial power at this point. But what sort of, pushes the boulder over the top of the hill?
I mean, it's hard to exactly pinpoint, but like a lot of the organizing of the revolution was done in secret. But I think there is like an aspect of a kind of divided ruling class, in terms of right, providing an opportunity for this kind of resistance. But it's also right, like, what sets it off? The violence of plantation slavery sets it off. That is the kind of inspiration for this fight, is fighting against this system. And so there's a series of meetings in August of 1791, done obviously covertly, one of which was likely a religious ceremony. And it was kind of primarily organized by enslaved people who had some degree of kind of mobility, right? Enslavers attempted to limit where enslaved people went, who they had communication with, but there were certain people who had certain jobs, who were able to communicate and to travel between plantations. And so they're the kind of primary organizers of the initial uprising. And they had a very kind of coordinated plan that kind of started near the primary economic hub, port city of the north, Cap Français. And it's in the kind of sugar region right below Cap Français, where the revolution starts. Their plan had been to attack the city of Cap Français, but the colonists were able to kind of rally defense. And so they end up moving into the mountains, within weeks, probably September of 1791. And I argue that while we don't know exactly, where Dessalines was at the start of the revolution, that he likely joined the revolution in probably September of 1791 as it moved into the mountains. And it's possible he was there beforehand, but the kind of, the geography of it doesn't necessarily suggest that.
So how does the French Revolution play a role in this? Sort of what years of the French Revolution, where does it start to impact what's going on in Saint-Domingue?
It's a complicated relationship between the two revolutions, right? And a lot of people, like, kind of an older historiography would be like, and then the French Revolution inspired the Haitian Revolution, as if, enslaved people didn't have their own ideas of freedom and equality, right?
Yeah.
Right.
And I think, what I try to emphasize in the book is that for the first years of the French Revolution, the French Revolution was very much pro-slavery, and insistent that slavery would not be affected by the French Revolution. There was no plans to abolish slavery. It was absolutely necessary for the colonies, and like, that's that. But you do see kind of some relationship between the two revolutions, in the sense that free people of color in the colony certainly used the French Revolution to advocate for their own rights. And what I find very interesting is that a lot of this advocacy for racial equality among free people, not advocating for the abolition of slavery, but a lot of this advocacy happened in Grande Rivière du Nord, where Dessalines was living. And so while there's no concrete evidence to show this, I suspect that he at least knew what was happening, right? He knew that free people of color were advocating for equal rights, and he knew that the colonial state was very intent, or kind of very sure, that they were not going to give them equal rights, right? And that they would violently punish any attempt to secure equal rights. So there's a kind of two-part relationship, right? That there's this clear fight for equality, these statements of universalism, but then a kind of a doubling down on racism and slavery at the same time. And this is very clear to people in the colony. It's only the revolutionaries in Saint-Domingue who end up pushing first the colonial state, but then the French Empire more broadly, pushing them to abolish slavery. And it's only after that the French Revolution, the French Republic is like, and we have always been for the abolition of slavery.
Right.
And they kind of, they like commandeer that narrative, and they're like, yes, this was always our goal, definitely. Whereas before they were like, definitely slavery is still happening.
There's nothing like a few uses of the guillotine to get people to be like, whatever's in vogue, I'm on board. I was always saying, I will deny it for the rest of my life that I said anything different. Okay, that's actually fascinating. I mean, it doesn't surprise me. I used to have, when I was younger, I think I had a little bit more confusion about the, calling for freedom while also suppressing people's rights at the same time. But that cognitive dissonance, for whatever reason, doesn't seem so crazy anymore. And I'll leave that at that.
I mean, I think, there's this like geographic argument.
Yeah.
But there's also just like a total, commitment to racism that was like, we meant universal, but like, obviously we meant only for white people. Like, it didn't need to be said because it was so kind of deeply embedded in the society.
I'd love to talk about the two individuals that you use as examples that I don't want to say light a spark, but they helped explain to me some of the issues that are quite complicated. And it was Jean-Baptiste Chauvin and Vincent Auger. Sort of what happened with them, what they were trying to do, and what the outcome was, because I think they're good examples of what's going on at this time period.
Yeah. So Jean-Baptiste Chauvin and Vincent Auger were free men of color who were from the region around where Dessalines lived. Chauvin was from Grande-Rivière, and Auger was from the neighboring parish of Dondon. I note that Vincent Auger always gets like the most attention because he had been in France advocating for the rights of free people of color, whereas I kind of try and shape my narrative around Chauvin, who stays in the colony and stays in Grande-Rivière du Nord while he's advocating for equal rights. And I think that his story is much more significant for Dessalines, even though Auger gets all the attention. And if you read like American newspapers at the time, they only ever mention Auger. And so I talk about this with my student. I'm like, what about Chauvin?
Yeah.
But they're plantation owners and enslavers, but Vincent Auger was much wealthier than Chauvin, and they were advocating for their own rights. Chauvin was in the colonial militia, and one of the things that they did where they were like, you need us, right? We maintain order in this colonial society, and they're referring to their role in the militia. Notably, Chauvin fought in the Battle of Savannah, along with many other free men of color from the colony. And they make the case using eventually, they start before the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, but they eventually use the document to say like, hey, listen, this is what you're saying, but they insist that they should be treated as free people and not kind of free people of color. And they say with a little asterisk, and this as a reference to whenever their names are written in notary documents or the parish records, they say what their race is. And so they're like, no, we just want to be free people. And they're not advocating for the abolition of slavery or the rights of enslaved people. And they're, resistance, their rebellion is met with violence. They're kind of very publicly, and it's like a gruesome execution. And they're as is kind of consistent with the colonial state, their heads are displayed on pikes as like warnings of what's to come. But then an interesting, like I referred to this kind of moment of remembering in a different way. But their memory ends up getting co-opted by the Haitian revolutionaries, even though they had not been advocating for the rights of enslaved people. The Haitian revolutionaries end up kind of, adopting their fight, subsuming it into their own, partially, I think, because of the resistance by the colonial state to their kind of demands for equal treatment, right? So then they see them as like, okay, we are in some ways part of the same fight, but very much they are a warning, not necessarily like a warning against resistance or advocating for equal rights, but a warning of like how brutal the colonial state is going to be. Right. And it's not that enslaved people didn't already know this, but that this kind of very specific, fight for rights would be met with the same kind of violence.
And I guess it puts into context that like if this is how they're responding to those guys, for us it'll be even worse.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's important because they still do it. Right. That the situation was that bad that they're like, that's what happened to them, and yet the risk is worth it because living in this colony is just that bad.
Yeah, Lynn, because that was a known thing. Even the treatment of enslaved people on sugar plantations in the Caribbean was like a known for its brutality, right?
Oh yeah, you
Like,
didn't want to be sent down to the West Indies. That was a threat. I mean,
right,
South
like
Carolina was pretty bad in and of itself, but a bigger threat was to go to the West Indies, to be sold down. Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, there's violence in slavery everywhere. But the kind of work on sugar plantations was known to be kind of extremely difficult. And one of the interesting ways that you see this is that after the revolution is over, sugar production really drops off. Coffee production continues to a certain degree, cotton production, but the sugar economy in Haiti, never ever gets close to what it was in Saint-Domingue, and that's because people were like, no, we're not doing that kind of work.
Right. Understandable. It's very, very dangerous work in sugar production. So can we talk a little bit about what Dessalines did sort of militarily or in that kind of realm during the revolution? And this is probably the time to ask about, I'm not going to say his name as beautifully as you said it, Louverture, if you can see or talk about who he is and why his name is so important and continued on positively, whereas Dessalines sort of had the opposite legacy.
Right. And this is one of the reasons why I'm like, yeah, there should be so many biographies of Toussaint Louverture because their stories are kind of very much intertwined.
Right.
And that relationship started before the revolution began. They knew each other when Dessalines was enslaved. And that is because the third person who enslaved Dessalines, Marie Marthe, she was the daughter of Toussaint Louverture. So it's unclear exactly when they first met. But when Dessalines was enslaved by the second guy, Philippe Jasmin leased his plantation, his coffee plantation, and the labor of the, I think, 13 enslaved people who lived there to his father-in-law, Toussaint Louverture, who at the time was going by Toussaint de Breda. And so there was a period of about 2.5 years when Dessalines was enslaved, where he was under the kind of authority, under the control of Toussaint Louverture. So their relationship begins in this like hierarchical situation in which Louverture is able to give orders and Dessalines is expected to obey them. It's unclear kind of what exactly that relationship looked like, but it was definitely, not one of kind of, equals. And that kind of, hierarchical relationship remains throughout their life. I don't know if, they stayed in touch after the end of that 2.5 year lease until the revolution. But, very soon after the revolution begins, Dessalines, fights in a unit under Louverture's control, right? And so it's possible that they did, in fact, stay in touch. But I think what that also signals is, like a level of respect. Eventually, I think it becomes friendship, in which, Dessalines is kind of willing to follow Louverture to battle. And so, he rises through the ranks in Louverture's unit. He eventually becomes an officer, and he primarily kind of gains his military reputation as he is fighting against the British, who we haven't gotten into this yet, but the British from Jamaica occupy parts of the south and west of the colony during the revolution because they see an opportunity. They were like, well, that place is in chaos. Let's go take it. And that's,
Right.
The Spanish do that a little bit too. And that's how Dessalines ends up kind of securing his legal freedom. But after the abolition of slavery in the entire French Empire in 1794, Louverture and his unit join the French Republic, right? They become like colonial officers fighting for the French Republic. And in this capacity, they're fighting against the British. They fight against the Spanish. And so he kind of like rises through the ranks and is very effective on the battlefield. And then there's a civil war within the colony after the British get kicked out, and which pits Toussaint Louverture in the north against André Rigaud in the south. And that's also an area, or a moment where Dessalines really kind of shines on the battlefield and helps Louverture secure victory. And so he's, by 1800, he's kind of considered second in command, or kind of debatably second in command to Louverture. And so he's really, he's successful on the battlefield, but he's always loyal to Louverture, and up until a point, right? And then they have this kind of break in their relationship that is, in some ways like forced by the Leclerc expedition, which is like a reinvasion of the colony by the French, directed by Napoleon Bonaparte.
Do you think that's at the point with the falling out of them, when Dessalines, is that why why Dessalines was able to have such a negative legacy, even though he was so close to Louverture, who had such a sort of hero legacy? Because it seems like they were so close. Why would one be so revered and one is called, violent and all these horrible things, and that we're not going to honor what he did?
It's possible, and I think that there's a couple moments in Dessalines' life where he is kind of seen to betray people of the revolution. Louverture is one of them. He's got, I think, so after Charles Leclerc, in the Leclerc expedition invades the colony, eventually a bunch of the generals kind of concede and ally with the Leclerc expedition. And Toussaint Louverture ends up being one of them, and then convinces Dessalines and this other guy, Charles Belair, to submit as well. But I think that's a moment where, there's like a split in their relationship. And I think Dessalines ends up losing respect for Louverture.
Right.
After that is, I think, complicit in his arrest and deportation, right? And so there's this kind of, it's a moment where he betrays Louverture. But I think that betrayal stems from this kind of previous conversation that they had, in which Louverture convinced Dessalines to surrender. And then there's another moment when Charles Belair revolts, but Dessalines does not revolt with him, and he gets arrested. And again, Dessalines is kind of complicit in his arrest there. So there are these kind of moments where he's seen to, to betray friends and colleagues. And I should note that Belair was in rebellion with his wife, Sanité. And Dessalines kind of betrays them both there. But there is this kind of infighting within the revolution,
Right.
and it's unclear exactly whether Dessalines and Belair ever got along, whether they had the same kind of vision for what was going to happen.
Right.
But I also think that like the kind of the real departure in terms of how they're portrayed is independence, and that Louverture can always be part of this narrative of the French Revolution, whereas Dessalines' narrative is much more of Haiti. And I sorry, and I or it isn't. It like can be framed that way, right? Like
Right.
and Louverture's narrative can be framed much more as the French Revolution. I
Right.
disagree that it should be, but that's how it gets kind of co-opted. And so there's much of more of the focus, like if you're trying to make Haiti fail as a country,
Mm-hmm.
then you slander Dessalines.
Right.
And
Yep.
that's, I think, a lot of it.
Makes a lot of sense.
So is the ungenerous version of the interpretation of those things like he did those things to his own benefit? Like he was, complicit in the arrest of those colleagues because, he was consolidating sort of his control. Like, hey, they're out of the way, and I'm the guy.
Yes, that he was power hungry,
Mm-hmm.
and climbing to the top, whatever. Which I don't think is really the case.
Sure.
I think it's much more complicated than that.
Always.
Oh,
Is there any, as far as the reputation for barbarism, is there any sort of like kernel of like truth in under that, like in terms of how he approached the military action or in how he, approached governing? Is that rooted in something true or and sort of exaggerated to the point of slander? Or
I mean, I think it again is complicated.
Yeah.
Too complicated. Criticizing military leaders for being violent is.
Yeah.
I was going to follow up
kinda
with
your
that
job,
about
right?
like
Yeah.
how do you criticize a revolutionary like violence
Right.
during a revolution? What does that actually mean in terms
Yeah.
of
Right.
And
Yeah.
they're fighting against a very violent system, and they are fighting against, in the case of like this Leclerc expedition, a very violent French expedition. And so, yes, he met violence with violence. But I think what is significant about how he gets portrayed is that he is made out to be like uniquely violent
Mm.
or extraordinarily violent, which I don't think is true.
Sure.
However, there's like another side to this. The generals in the Leclerc expedition see him as being extremely violent, extraordinarily violent, and that's why they think he's useful.
Okay.
Right? So they're like, oh, we can use him
Mm-hmm.
because he is uniquely violent. And so that's why he doesn't get executed or either executed or arrested and deported like Louverture, right? So they're like, okay, we need him around, we can use him. He knows this, right? And so in this, there's like a 4-month period during the Leclerc expedition where Dessalines is allied with the expedition. And this is after the surrender that he kind of was unhappy with.
Sure.
And so they're like, we can use him as like an enforcer. And, there's a bunch of revolutionaries who refuse to ally with the Leclerc expedition. And so they're trying to kind of subdue those, they call them rebels. And so he's being used in that capacity. He's also being used to like force formerly enslaved people to return to the plantations to work as they're called cultivators, cultivateurs. And so he's like, okay, this is why I'm still alive. This is why I'm still in the colony.
Right.
And a lot of the descriptions that you end up getting, if you kind of trace through the archival record, they're like, wow, he's so violent. But then you look at like the chain of how that gets passed down, and it's all coming from him. He's like, I am so violent,
Right.
in fact, right? It is very hard to tell exactly what happened during this time period. But if you look, he's like, and I did all of this, and I subdued these people, and and he's like repeating all of this, like, and I did all this violence just like you told me to.
Yeah.
And then his superiors are like, and wow, isn't he violent? And wow, isn't he, like, and they kind of pass on the message. So, I think there's a way that this violence is like attributed to him, but then he sees this as a kind of, strategically, he's like, okay, I'm going to use this to kind of better situate myself, to save my life. It's a combination of various factors, but
Yeah, their reputation was an asset at the time.
right.
And then, those
That's
same words later
interesting.
are used against him for,
Exactly.
Okay, that's interesting.
And it's really hard to pull out fact from fiction in all of these descriptions.
Right.
But I
Yeah, I
do
don't-
think it's something that he wielded.
Yeah, I don't know why it reminded me of I've read some analysis of people talking about Caesar's descriptions of the campaign in Gaul during things, and like all the descriptions of what um, the Celtic warriors and were coming from Caesar. Like they were all 7 feet tall, fought naked, and
Right.
had all the, you know what I mean? Look, and we were able to conquer them all. And these guys were, they had bestial fury of like, and all those like sort of like ridiculous descriptions were set because Caesar won, and he wanted his victory to seem even more amazing.
Mhm.
Right? But it was all probably 99% fictitious because it was a political move at the time, which seems like this is very similar. Like it may have been somewhat true, but
He was
why?
exaggerating.
He may have been
because
exaggerating himself. Yeah.
for good reason.
I think
Yeah.
there's also like an aspect of, in descriptions of what's going on at this time, that Dessalines, because he was Black, gets kind of held to different standards in terms of his actions, right? And they're like, he is acting barbaric. He is not kind of following the rules of civilized warfare,
Sure.
whatever that means. When like the French people themselves felt no need to follow the rules of civilized warfare because they were like, oh, well, we're fighting against Black people, right? And so there's this like disconnect that it's like, well, you should be, or we can criticize you for not measuring up to this standard that we're setting, but like we're also not going to do it because we're fighting against you.
Right.
Yeah, you just mentioned heads on pikes like not that long ago.
Right.
Exactly, right. And like during the Leclerc expedition, this is he's kind of ordering mass murder. They are putting people on ships and suffocating them, and like there are all of these like absolute atrocities happening, and they're like, actually, but he's the violent one.
Right.
Yeah, listen, he didn't give up his sword when he like he did give me his sword and his glove at the end of the our combatants. How rude. But that makes total sense because there is, pun not intended, but there's a whitewashing of revolutionary leaders in all sorts of sense, even on like a personality basis.
Absolutely.
Like we've talked on the podcast before about George Washington's cruelty being something that's totally really forgotten and by a lot of people, it's just not mentioned. But there's to bring it up to provide some context to it. It's like quickly, and there was one moment where he was at Mount Vernon, and he had at one point allowed the enslaved men to keep hunting dogs, and one of them had stolen some, either killed an animal or was it stolen some food?
Yeah, it
meat
was
or something
either
like that?
cattle or sheep.
Yeah, killed something.
Yeah.
And then he had everyone's dogs slaughtered, specifically hung. So that's hundreds of dogs and animals because one person couldn't keep their dog on the leash, and that is just mind-bogglingly cruel and insensitive in a way that is we just don't ever talk about, because he won and he was the white guy and is the hero of the story.
Right.
But yeah, he doesn't, obviously Dessalines doesn't get that same generosity.
No, and notably the French imported dogs from Cuba to use them to try to attack Haitian revolutionaries.
Right.
Well, that's interesting.
Right. So there's like, it's not the same, but there's
yeah.
It's
another one of their tactics.
Yeah.
Right.
So to make sure we get sort of to the end of the revolution,
obviously,
we want to make sure we talk about that part.
There's more content here than is capable of us covering.
Way more. That's why you have to buy the book.
Conversations with like I was interested in after the revolution,
right?
And now we're not even there yet.
Well, you definitely got to buy the book, listeners.
Exactly. So can you explain it's hard to do in brief, but can you tell us how this revolution ended in the abolishment of slavery and Saint-Domingue becoming the independent nation of Haiti.
Between 1793 and 94, kind of there's like a slash because of the different abolitions of slavery. But for about 10 years, Saint-Domingue exists as a French colony where slavery is abolished. At the end of that decade, the Leclerc expedition happens. Napoleon comes to power in France and says, we need to regain control over the colony. This is in response to a colonial constitution issued by Toussaint Louverture that was intended to preserve the abolition of slavery because, there was like pro-slavery forces gaining power in France. And he was like, we're a little worried. So many, including Napoleon, see this 1801 constitution as basically a declaration of independence, even though Louverture was like, it wasn't, I promise. And that's why I sent it to you for ratification. Napoleon sends the Leclerc expedition. There's this kind of 4-month period where Dessalines, surrenders and allies with the Leclerc expedition. But then, very critically, news arrives in the colony that the French are going to allow slavery in places where it had never been abolished because those places had been occupied by the British. And so, slavery was once again legal in parts of the French Empire, which kind of opens the door for slavery everywhere.
Right.
And this is when a lot of the generals, including Dessalines, kind of flip and they start fighting a war for independence. So up until the fall of 1802, it hadn't been a war for independence. After that time, it becomes a war for independence. They're like, we can't trust these people. Our future is never secure under French colonialism. And it's unclear exactly when during that time, but pretty quickly Dessalines becomes the primary leader of that war for independence. And eventually they're fighting under their military is called the Armée Indigène, the indigenous army, which could be a reference to the indigenous population of the island before French colonialism. But it could also just be a reference to their claims to the territory because they were born there. And most of the leaders of the Haitian Revolution were Creole.
Okay.
And so, by mid 1803, they're really planning for independence. And this is this is like my gateway into studying Dessalines was like his diplomatic negotiations. And mid 1803 is where that story really starts. And he sends a letter to Thomas Jefferson. He sends a letter to the governor of Jamaica trying to establish trade relations with each of them. Obviously, Thomas Jefferson never responds, but the governor of Jamaica eventually does. And there's this kind of, alliance through hatred of France relationship between the two, which is not perfect. And
whatever it takes.
The British are not really willing to treat Dessalines or Haiti as equals. And so that relationship breaks down. But by November of 1803, the French have kind of lost the war. However, very importantly, they do not concede that they have lost the war. And so the remainder of the French troops evacuate from the western side of the island in November of 1803. And then on January 1st, 1804, they declare Haitian independence. And they rename, in that document, they rename the country Haiti, or Haiti, which was the name, if your listeners will remember, we already talked about this, the name that the island was called before the arrival of Columbus. And I think that this is like a really interesting symbolic gesture that it's erasing French colonialism. We're not taking Saint-Domingue or Santo Domingo.
Right.
But then very importantly, the word Haiti meant mountainous. And the kind of interior region of the colony, then country, was kind of very mountainous. And that had been a place where they were very successful in the battlefield. It had been a place of refuge. And, during the colonial period, it had been a place of refuge for fugitive slaves. And so I think that there's an interesting way that Haiti kind of symbolizes the erasure of colonialism, but then also symbolizes freedom.
So to wrap up some of this, Lynn, do you have any other questions?
Overview.
Yeah, that was a great overview.
We went very quickly through a very complicated period.
Yeah. Well, if you want more details, again, buy the book. There's a link in the description below.
You have to read the book.
I'm curious to know how you came to pick your title and what the significance of it is, and as well as the cover. because I thought that the picture was an interesting, a very striking choice.
It is a very striking, yes. I'll start with that one. It's a painting by the Haitian American artist Ulrich Jean-Pierre. One of the things that is noteworthy about Dessalines' life is that there are no images, woodcuts, paintings, whatever, of him that were done by anybody who had ever seen him.
Oh, geez.
And so from his life, all we have are like very racist descriptions of what he looked like.
Mm-hmm.
And so, people have been kind of free to imagine what Dessalines looked like in a variety of ways. And I like Ulrich Jean-Pierre's painting because it is this kind of powerful version of Dessalines that is not, centered on violence, even though he does look powerful. And then, anyway, I'm very grateful that that he kind of let me use it. And like everybody who sees the cover is like, wow. And I'm like, I know, I love that painting too. And then the title, I Have Avenged America, is unsurprisingly a quotation from Dessalines. And this is from probably his second most famous proclamation, the Declaration of Independence being the most famous. And it's from April of 1804. And it's after this kind of other, complicated 4 months of his life in which, because the French were still waging war against the country, he had executed remaining, not all of them, but several hundred at least, remaining French colonists on the island.
Mm-hmm.
And these people were people who had participated in the Leclerc expedition. They were people who were threatening the country, and they were people who had participated in the crimes committed during the colonial period, the crime of slavery. Mm-hmm. And this is obviously one of the reasons why Dessalines is remembered as being kind of extraordinarily violent. Is that, the argument is that, after the revolution was over, after the war was over, he killed all these people. And the term that gets used, that got used at the time, and that often still gets used in scholarship today, is massacres. That he massacred all these French people. And I think that description really downplays the ongoing threat that the French posed, and and they were very explicitly saying this, we are going to reinvade. That is still our colony. It's not an independent country. A new expedition is coming. We are invading, and so these executions were a response to that continued threat. Right. But after these executions happened, he issued this proclamation that is kind of referred to as the "I Have Avenged America" speech. And he's kind of describing, I think, both the very recent executions, but I think the revolution more generally, in terms of their fight against colonialism and slavery, and his kind of success in leading this fight, that he had avenged America. And I like the reference to America in the kind of hemispheric sense, right? That even though, he was fighting for his own freedom, for his people's freedom, for his country's freedom, that there's a sense that, their fight is part of this broader struggle throughout the Americas against slavery, colonialism, and racism. So I really liked that as a kind of situating of what he was doing.
Yeah, sounds like the perfect title.
Yeah,
That's fantastic.
I think it has even more meaning in that context that you were just talking, knowing that Haiti, Haiti, is named after the original name of the island, right? Or the pre-Columbian name of the island, which is that it makes a lot more sense. It makes a lot of sense and has a ton of meaning to it. That's awesome. Those are great choices.
Thank you. And there's and I had almost nothing to do with the cover design, so I can just I'm I love the font, I love everything about it. Right. And there's a little printer's ornament that I kind of helped contribute to the design, that's taken from the Haitian Declaration of Independence.
Oh, nice.
And it appears on the spine and kind of at the start of every chapter.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Overall, I love what they did with the book.
And people can buy it anywhere. It's We always try to recommend people go to, independent bookstores.
Yeah, your local bookstore. If you don't see it, ask them to buy it.
Yes.
They will more than likely purchase a few copies so that you can
Mhm.
buy one from your local bookstore.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's a great book. Really, really good.
Thank
Yeah.
you so much.
And I think it was definitely needed. Prior to the interview, I did glance at Dessalines' Wikipedia page, and it is a pitiful 4 paragraphs long.
Uh-oh.
Well, and I talk about Wikipedia in my epilogue, and the slander on Wikipedia about Dessalines. And there's like various pages. There's like the Haitian Revolution page, and there's like, there are a series of pages. I can't remember what one's called, but there's one that talks about the 1804 executions. But I think, says also referred to as the 1804 genocide, which I argue against in the book. So, I have like a complicated relationship with Wikipedia in terms of like what people know about Dessalines.
Once your book gets out there, once some of these Wikipedia editors start seeing reading it, that this gets fleshed out and corrected. I've never seen a page with more red links before in my life. And red links on Wikipedia are ones that don't have a page reference. Like they look like they're referencing a page, but they're not actually. There's nothing there. The 1804 Haitian genocide, quote unquote, is one of those dead links. It doesn't link to anything.
Yeah. Well, we can only hope that those fix and the narrative gets fixed.
Well, thank you for undertaking the difficult, story and writing such a wonderful book about it.
Thank you so much. I'm glad you guys liked it.
Yeah, and for taking your time to come on here and try to make it less complicated for those of us who are a little less expert in the field.
I was glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you guys for listening.